So I'm glad you brought up Sharia, and I want to get to that in a second. But I said at the beginning I wasn't going to ask you about the past again. But I think something that I get people ask me about, like, you know, when they'll ask me, when did you wake up to this stuff and start talking about some of this stuff? So for you, was there actually a moment? Like, was it when you left Somalia, and then from then on, this idea about individualism and all of this really stuck with you, or was it as your travels continued and some of the bad things that happened and now some of the good things? Like, was there really a moment where your ideology got crystallized?
It was gradual, and I didn't have an ideology. I just, you know, felt the pain of being told, you can't do this, you have to do that, and being resentful and feeling powerless and thinking, well, I would like to do something. I don't want to marry this man because I don't want to end up like my mother and like all these other women I've grown up around who feel powerless and who feel trapped in this, who really wonder, what is life all about? Why all this suffering? And is there something I can do as an individual to be different and to make my own circumstances different? So when I went to Holland and I found people and a society and a culture that actually made it possible and enhanced all of that, I started to think about not so much, you know, develop a counter ideology, but just try and understand what's this all about. And in my years in Leiden, I went to the University of Leiden, no safe spaces, none of that nonsense existed.
Yeah.
I got introduction to all the various philosophies that preceded the one that we enjoyed at that point in time in the Netherlands. And then 9/11 happened, and you know that brought the issue of Islam for me as a Muslim, as a former Muslim. At the time, I identified as a Muslim. And so I found myself in 2001, 2002 thinking about, okay, how does all this relate to me, and where do I stand in this?
Yeah. Okay, so from there then, let's go back now to Sharia and to Dawah and to political Islam. How do we talk about this in a way that's not going to make people crazy? We've already got the idea of ideas and people, that these are different things, and you've already talked about that there are a certain amount of course of Muslims that are good people. As you said, we don't even know what that number is. It could be a much bigger number than people might think. We simply don't know. But how do we explain the dangers of what political Islam is without getting lost in the mess?
We use the tools that we use to explain other threats and other dangers, as long as you're consistent. If you're studying HIV, you have to know something about viruses, and you have to know something about infections, and you have to know something about blood-to-blood transmissions, and you know all the ways that that virus behaves. If you're studying cancers and other threats, malaria, all of that, you've got to know everything about the causes, the vectors, and all the other environmental issues that exacerbate the problem. With Islam, I find that very often we talk about symptoms, we talk about the environment, we talk about disenfranchised young men, we talk about countries that feel that because they have autocratic and they have dictatorships, that maybe the populations are acting out in a certain way. But we hardly ever talk about the core of the issue. And as far as I'm concerned, if we want to defeat what it is that makes ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, so attractive, and Al-Qaeda and all these other groups so attractive, we will not be able to do that without learning something about the life and legacy of Muhammad, the founder of Islam. About part of that legacy is the Quran. What is it that he says was revealed to me, and how does that operate in the day-to-day lives of people?
Yeah.
The leadership, the Saudi Arabian government spent billions of dollars spreading part of that legacy across the entire world. That is an activity, that's dawah. That's an activity to Islamize non-Islamic societies and to strengthen Islam or radical Islam or political Islam within majority Muslim societies. So if we don't understand, if we don't scrutinize these activities and don't analyze them properly, we will always be chasing the symptoms.
Yeah, and this is what we see when we see that Germany that the amount of mosques in Germany that are funded by Saudi Arabia is up by some, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's some crazy percentage, and that they're teaching these ideas. So what is the goal then? When they say what is the goal of dawah? Is it truly to turn these Western countries into Islamic nations, to have a bunch of Westernized people actually suddenly living under Sharia law?
It's to Islamize. And, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, is very explicit about it when he's speaking in Turkish. He wants to Islamize Europe. He advises immigrants, Muslim immigrants, to have more children because he thinks that's the fastest way.
Yeah.
And governments like that of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait, they pump a lot of money into Western societies and target immigrant groups and ask them not to assimilate, because to assimilate means less Islamization, and to create these parallel societies where they live by what I call Sharia light. Mm-hmm. And Sharia light always starts with trying to cover up women and establishing Sharia councils where marriage and divorce laws and laws of custody, women are persuaded not to take advantage of or to recognize the normal secular laws that protect them.
So this is literally a set of laws that exists sort of parallel to our regular secular laws, but it replaces them, and this is what certain people are living under.
It's now become a reality, and ever larger numbers of Muslims are adopting this Sharia light and this idea that at some point Europe is going to be Islamized and the West can be turned against itself to become Islamic. Now, what we see is there are those groups who use force and violence, they use terrorism, and then there are the governments and the legitimates. They're called legitimate because they are not using violence. At least that's how they regard themselves, that are working within the system to expand the number of people who accept willingly that these Sharia-like laws apply to them. So they create parallel communities or parallel societies. Now, are they going to really succeed in their goal of Islamizing Europe? I don't know. I hope not. I don't think so. But they're trying.
Yeah.
And I think there's nothing wrong in recognizing the fact that they're actually trying.
Yeah. So do we get lost in too much of the violence? I mean, if you were to ask the average person who doesn't know that much about this, they would say, well, I'm mostly concerned because I see trucks driving into people in Sweden and shootings in Paris and the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, et cetera, et cetera. But that really may be a distraction from really what's going on. Like, do these things work together? Are the jihadists and the Islamists, even though you're saying they have totally different, the ideologies are different, are they somehow in cahoots?
Well, our liberal governments do what I think primarily governments must do, which is protect people from terrorist activity. So we have intelligence communities that are monitoring individuals and groups who are planning the next terrorist attack. And I think that should continue. Mm-hmm. But the rest of us who are not monitoring terrorists, we should understand the process before the jihad. So before a guy jumps in a car or in a truck with a knife in his hand or with a gun in his hand, you've got to understand how is it that this man came to this conclusion. He's going to kill strangers, people he doesn't know. What is it? And when you look at the history of all the people who've been captured and were able to talk about it, they just say, I'm doing it because I believe that it's my religion. They believe that they're going to heaven for doing it. Yeah. And the more you listen to them, the more you compare the notes to what they hear in mosques and what's taught at Islamic schools, what is preached sometimes on the streets. See, there's all this non-violent activity that is taking full advantage, exploiting the freedom of association, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, to spread this idea among people. That is, I think, when we as a society should wake up to this and say, wait a second, what is this message? What are these people teaching? Which groups and individuals are they targeting? What is their objective? And can we develop a counter-narrative? And we have that counter-narrative. We don't even have to develop it. Yeah. We just need to market it to those individuals and groups that they target. Yeah. I'm perfectly happy to talk to, and these are the people that I would like to talk to, the prisoners, the immigrants, everywhere, and tell them, listen, you come from a country where Sharia is actually the law, and you fled that country. It's not a great life. You're now in a free country. Do you know what the two different philosophies and the two different principles are that each of these countries is founded on? This is what Sharia, countries that are founded on the Sharia principle, this is what they look like in real life. Life is miserable. It's miserable for women, it's miserable for religious minorities, it's miserable for gays, it's miserable for men, it's miserable for
everyone. That's what I think. It's miserable for most of the Muslim people that live there that just want to be free. I think in this case a good example is just forget the minorities, just think of the majority.
Majorities, it's miserable for everyone. You look at these other nation states that are founded on the principle of freedom, of equality, of tolerance. Hey, life may not be what heaven is painted out to be, where you can have 72 virgins at a time, and drink wine.
Seems like a bit much. It seems like a bit much.
So it's not, that fantastical and utopic and, in my view, kind of, really stupid. But I wouldn't even use the word stupid. I would just say, hey, it might not be as Disneyfied as that. But, you're free to do what you want. Life is stable. It's predictable. You can have your friends in your community. You can build. You can have a passion and develop it. You can indulge your senses, art, music, love for cooking, love for others. It's so much more attractive. In fact, when I came to Holland and here in America, often I think, but this is paradise. I want to live as long as possible. I don't want to go to this promised paradise. And so we have to start talking to the same audiences about, is there really an afterlife? Was Muhammad really moral? Should you really follow everything that Muhammad said to this day? Or are there some things that are unacceptable? I mean, it's a few centuries later.
And we should at least be able to talk about it, at the very least.
And we should talk about this in elementary schools, in high schools, in universities. That's where young people are. We should use cultural tools, the cinema, music, everything, to try and influence them to make these choices. But we've got to make them aware of this other choice, the principles of freedom, because that's not where they come from. They don't know it.
So is that really where the West has failed? That, your phrase about the tolerance of intolerance, and you're making a very clear case that they want to use our tolerance against us, and yet our tolerance is so built in to the West. Of course, we have problems, and there's, people, we have monetary, people have all sorts of different amount of money and all kinds of problems. And there, of course, are still people that are racist and all of those things. But that our basic tolerance is now being turned on us, and we haven't done a good job selling it, right? Because we do find out that a lot of these jihadists, they don't come from poor families. Many of them come from well-to-do families, and many of them are well-educated and all of those things, which if we would push that idea out more, perhaps it would give us a little more credit in what we're trying to do.
In what we're trying to do, I think it is the recognition that it is not, like we talked about the symptoms, it's not because people are poor. In fact, I think people are poor because if the principle of Sharia is the prevailing principle, people will be poor. Sharia is not about making money. Sharia is about trying to adhere to a set of rules very blindly that are economically unfriendly and that increase inequality. I mean, look at the position of women. If you lock up women that way and you keep them ignorant, you're going to have a society that's extremely poor and with great inequality. With Sharia, it may be well-intended, whatever the intentions are. I can't see the well in there. But you are also creating circumstances for the abuse of power. Power is concentrated in the hands of very few people. The clergymen who believe that they can tell you the difference between right and wrong, who put themselves on God's seat. So it's just, it opens the doors for ultimate pure exploitation. And we in the West, we have failed to sell. And I think part of it is because the people, present day Westerners, didn't do the fighting. They were not the young, hungry, scrappy men that made this country. They're the ones who inherited it after several generations. So people don't know. I remember being in Holland and seeing, this idea of freedom was, it was the identity of the Dutchman, almost a biological identity. They took it so for granted. They couldn't understand why people didn't just adapt.
Yeah.
Yeah. They didn't think that they didn't see that it was something that they had learned from their parents and their environment. Their parents had learned from their parents. And I always compare it to, wealthy, children of wealthy family businesses. The first generation is the one that makes the money.
Right.
The next generation kind of knows what the first generation went through. They are conscious of the fact that they have to carry these responsibilities forward. But ultimately, a generation comes that just spends and doesn't know where it all comes from.
Yeah.
And part of me thinks, we're living at a time when lots of Westerners are really spending this legacy of freedom, and they don't know what it is not to be free. They don't know what inequality really means. I'm not talking about inequality of outcomes.
Yeah.
I'm talking about this idea that is ingrained in people outside of the West, that they have an inferior spot and that's their spot.
Yeah.
So as women, you're inferior in a caste system. You belong to your caste and you can never come out of it. And there's no social mobility. Or if there's social mobility, it's because of Western influence. It's not an organic thing that comes out of these cultures. So Westerners just think, people will come to it.
Yeah. And it's just simply not true.
It's not true, and it's dangerous, because if we don't engage in a dawah for freedom, we're going to be overtaken by the dawah for Sharia.